The altitude warning screamed through the cockpit at exactly 7:43 a.m. Captain Robert. Harrison's coffee cup tumbled to the floor as his body went rigid, then slumped forward against the yoke. The Embraer ERJ-145 pitched nose down, 47. Passengers aboard. Cruising altitude dissolving into a terrifying descent toward the Colorado landscape below. In the right seat, First Officer Sarah Mitchell watched the horizon tilt sideways through the windscreen, her hands already moving toward the controls before her mind fully processed what was happening. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Mountain View 847, altitude deviation noted, please confirm. Status, crackled through the radio from Denver approach control. The autopilot disengaged with a sharp electronic whine, leaving nothing between the aircraft and the ground except Sarah's steady grip on the yoke. Captain Harrison's breathing was shallow, labored, his face ashen gray against the morning sunlight streaming through the cockpit windows. She checked his pulse quickly, found it rapid and irregular, then keyed the radio with practiced calm. Denver approach, Mountain View 847, declaring emergency. Captain is incapacitated. First officer assuming control. Medical emergency in progress, requesting immediate vectors to nearest suitable airport. Her voice cut through the static clear and professional, while her left hand pulled the aircraft out of its descent and her right adjusted the throttles. The jet responded sluggishly, heavy with fuel and passengers, but it responded. The radio exploded with chatter. Multiple voices overlapped, air traffic controllers coordinating emergency procedures, other aircraft being diverted from their path. Through it all, Sarah's hands moved with mechanical precision, trimming the aircraft, adjusting heading, monitoring the engine parameters that spelled the difference between controlled flight and disaster. She glanced once more at Captain Harrison, noted the blue tinge around his lips, and made the first of many decisions that would define the next 23 minutes of her life. The morning had started like every other morning for the past 3 years. Sarah Mitchell pulled into the employee parking lot at Pine Valley Regional Airport at 5:47 a.m., her Honda Civic looking shabby among the pickup trucks and SUVs of the maintenance crews already beginning their shifts. She grabbed her flight bag from the passenger seat, a worn leather case that had belonged to her father, and walked across the tarmac toward the operations building. The autumn air was crisp, mountain peaks visible in the distance, painted pink by the sunrise. It was the kind of morning that reminded her why she loved flying, even when everything else about the job had become a grinding routine of disappointment. In the crew room, she found Captain Harrison already seated at the metal table, studying weather reports with the focused attention of a man who had been flying for 24 years and intended to fly for 24 more. He looked up when she entered, nodded once, and returned to his charts. No greeting, no small talk, just the professional courtesy of a senior pilot acknowledging his first officer. Sarah had flown with Harrison 6 times in the past month, and their relationship had never progressed beyond the essential communications required to operate an aircraft safely. "Weather's clear all the way to Salt Lake," Harrison said without looking up. "Light winds, good visibility, should be smooth." He folded the papers with precise creases and tucked them into his flight case. "Dispatch says we're carrying 47 passengers this morning. Full load." Sarah nodded and began her own pre-flight preparations, pulling out her charts and running through the checklist that had become second nature. She had memorized every approach into Salt Lake City, knew the fuel calculations by heart, could recite the emergency procedures in her sleep. 3 years as a first officer had given her thousands of hours of experience, but in the rigid hierarchy of commercial aviation, experience meant nothing without the captain's bars on her shoulders. And those bars seemed to slip further away with each passing month. The passenger manifest showed a typical Thursday morning load. Business travelers heading to meetings in Salt Lake City. A few families starting early vacations, students returning to college. Sarah scanned the names and seat assignments, noting the presence of 2 unaccompanied minors and an elderly passenger who had requested wheelchair assistance. Standard protocol, routine flight, the kind of trip she could fly blindfolded. She checked her watch and gathered her materials for the walk to the aircraft. Mountain View Flight 847 sat on the ramp like a sleeping bird, its white fuselage gleaming in the morning light. The Embraer ERJ-145 was a reliable aircraft, popular with regional carriers for its efficiency and range. Sarah had logged over 800 hours in type, knew its systems and quirks better than she knew her own car. The external pre-flight inspection took 15 minutes, checking control surfaces, tires, lights, and the dozens of other items that stood between safe flight and catastrophe. Everything looked normal, routine, unremarkable. Inside the cockpit, the familiar smell of leather and aviation fuel filled her nostrils as she settled into the right seat. The instrument panel spread before her like a constellation of dials and switches, each one critical to the safe operation of the aircraft. She began the interior pre-flight checklist, testing radios, checking circuit breakers, verifying that every system was functioning within normal parameters. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Captain Harrison climbed into the left seat and began his own checks, the 2 of them working in coordinated silence. Flight attendant Jennifer Walsh poked her head into the cockpit to report that passenger boarding was complete and the cabin was secure. She was new to Mountain View Airlines, barely 6 months on the job, and still enthusiastic about the work in a way that reminded Sarah of her own early days in aviation. Jennifer's smile was genuine as she confirmed the passenger count and reported that everyone was seated and ready for departure. 47 souls on board, cabin secure, we're ready when you are, Jennifer said, using the formal language that reduced human beings to statistical data for the purpose of emergency planning. Sarah had always hated that phrase, souls on board, as if the aircraft were some kind of vessel, ferrying spirits across the afterlife rather than people with jobs and families and plans for the day ahead. The taxi to the runway took 8 minutes, following the yellow centerline past other aircraft preparing for departure or returning from their own journeys. Pine Valley Regional was a modest airport, handling mostly regional traffic and the occasional corporate jet, but it was busy enough to require careful coordination of ground movements. Sarah listened to the radio chatter between ground control and other aircraft, a constant stream of instructions and acknowledgments that formed the invisible web of aviation safety. At the runway threshold, Captain Harrison ran through the final checklist items while Sarah completed the takeoff briefing. Standard departure, climb to flight level 280, estimated flight time 1 hour and 18 minutes. The morning sun was fully up now, promising a day of severe clear weather and smooth flying conditions. Harrison advanced the throttles and the Embraer began its roll down runway 24, gathering speed with the steady acceleration of a well-maintained turbine engine. The aircraft lifted off at exactly 7:31 a.m., climbing into air so clear that the Rocky Mountains seemed close enough to touch. Sarah monitored the engine parameters and navigation displays, while Harrison flew the departure procedure, their roles clearly defined by years of training and regulation. At 10,000 feet, they were cleared to continue climbing to their cruising altitude, the aircraft settling into the steady rhythm of cross-country flight. For 12 minutes, everything was perfectly normal. The autopilot engaged smoothly. At 18,000 feet, the engines hummed with mechanical contentment, and the Colorado landscape spread below them like a detailed map. Captain Harrison sipped his coffee and monitored the flight management computer, while Sarah handled radio communications with air traffic control. It was the kind of routine flight that filled the logbooks of professional pilots unremarkable, except for the quiet satisfaction of another safe departure. At 7:43 a.m., Robert Harrison set his coffee cup in the center console and reached for his chart case. His hand stopped halfway there, fingers suddenly rigid, his entire body going stiff, as if he had been struck by lightning. The coffee cup fell to the floor, sending brown liquid across the cockpit carpet, while Harrison's other hand clutched at his chest. His face contorted in pain, then went slack as consciousness left him and his weight fell forward against the flight controls. The autopilot disconnected immediately, overwhelmed by the unexpected control input. The aircraft pitched nose down as Harrison's unconscious body pressed against the yoke, beginning a descent that would become a dive if not corrected within seconds. The altitude alerting system screamed its electronic warning while the airspeed indicator began climbing toward dangerous levels. In the cabin behind them, passengers felt their stomachs drop as the aircraft suddenly pointed toward the earth, coffee spilling and magazines sliding to the floor. Sarah's hands moved faster than conscious thought, pulling back on her yoke to arrest the descent while her left hand reached across the cockpit to push Harrison's body back into his seat. His weight was dead, unresponsive, and she could see immediately that this was not a simple fainting spell or momentary disorientation. His breathing was rapid and shallow, his skin gray and clammy with perspiration. Classic signs of cardiac distress, possibly a full myocardial infarction. The radio crackled with Denver Approach Control's voice, professional but edged with concern. Mountain View 847, altitude deviation noted. Please confirm status. Sarah keyed the microphone while simultaneously trimming the aircraft back to level flight, her voice steady despite the chaos unfolding in the cockpit. Denver Approach, Mountain View 847, declaring emergency. Captain is incapacitated. First officer assuming control. Medical emergency in progress. Requesting immediate vectors to nearest suitable airport. She released the microphone and checked Harrison's pulse, finding it rapid and irregular, confirming her worst suspicions. The response from air traffic control was immediate and professional. Mountain View 847, roger your emergency. Squawk 7700, turn left heading 180, vectors to Denver International. Emergency equipment standing by. Say souls on board and fuel remaining. 847 turning left to 180, squawking emergency. 47 souls on board. Approximately 4,000 pounds fuel remaining. Sarah banked the aircraft to the new heading while running quick calculations in her head. Denver International was 60 miles away, too far with an incapacitated captain and a cabin full of frightened passengers. She needed options, and she needed them quickly. Behind her, she could hear Jennifer Walsh's voice over the cabin intercom, calm and reassuring as she spoke to the passengers. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a minor technical issue that requires us to return to Denver. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We'll have you on the ground shortly. Professional understatement, the kind of careful language designed to prevent panic while acknowledging that something was definitely wrong. Sarah scanned the cockpit instruments, noting that all systems were functioning normally except for the human element. The engines were running smoothly. Hydraulics were normal. Electrical systems showed no anomalies. The aircraft was perfectly capable of flight, but it needed a pilot who was conscious and able to make the hundreds of small decisions required to bring 47 people safely back to Earth. For the first time in her career, that responsibility fell entirely on her shoulders. Captain Harrison stirred briefly, his eyes opening with unfocused confusion before closing again. His breathing remained labored, and Sarah could see perspiration beading on his forehead, despite the cool cockpit air. She loosened his collar and tried to make him as comfortable as possible while maintaining control of the aircraft, but it was clear that he would not be resuming his duties anytime soon. Whatever was happening to him required immediate medical attention, the kind that could only be provided on the ground. The radio came alive with multiple voices as word of the emergency spread through the air traffic control system. Other aircraft were being diverted from their path. Emergency equipment was being positioned at Denver International, and medical personnel were being notified of the situation. Sarah listened to the coordination with half her attention, while focusing on the immediate task of flying the aircraft safely. 3 years as a first officer had prepared her for this moment, though she had hoped it would never come. Mountain View 847, Denver approach. Be advised weather at Denver International is clear, winds light and variable. Emergency equipment is standing by on runway 16R. Expect vectors for a straight-in approach. The controller's voice was calm and professional, but Sarah could hear the underlying tension that came with handling an aircraft in distress. She acknowledged the transmission and began running through the emergency checklist for incapacitated crew member, though most of the items were already complete. Autopilot disengaged, check. Aircraft under control, check. Emergency declared, check. Medical assessment complete, check. The next item on the list was to determine the best course of action for landing, and that was where the situation became complicated. Denver International Airport was the nearest major facility, but it was also one of the busiest airports in the country. Even with emergency priority, there would be delays for approach clearance, ground traffic, and coordination with emergency vehicles. Sarah calculated fuel consumption and distance, factoring in the need for approach procedures and possible holding patterns. The numbers worked, but barely, and that assumed everything went perfectly from this point forward. A different voice came over the radio, identifying himself as the Mountain View Airlines operations manager. 847, this is David Thompson in operations. We're coordinating with medical personnel for Captain Harrison's care upon landing. Can you give us an assessment of his condition? Sarah glanced at Harrison, noting that his breathing had become more regular but remained shallow. His color was still poor, and he showed no signs of regaining consciousness. Operations 847. Captain appears to be experiencing cardiac distress. Unconscious but stable breathing. Recommend medical personnel standing by for immediate transport to cardiac facility. Copy that, 847. We're coordinating with Denver General. They have a cardiac unit standing by. Sarah, you're doing great. Just get everyone home safe. The use of her first name was unusual in the formal world of aviation radio communications, but she appreciated the human touch in what had become an entirely technical situation. David Thompson had been with Mountain View Airlines for 15 years, and he knew the stress that came with emergency situations. His calm confidence helped steady her nerves as she continued flying toward Denver. The landscape below had changed. From the rugged mountains of central Colorado to the rolling plains that surrounded the Denver metropolitan area. She could see the city in the distance, a cluster of buildings rising from the prairie with the distinctive peaked roof of Denver International Airport visible on the horizon. The aircraft was performing flawlessly, responding to her control inputs with the predictable behavior that made modern aviation possible. In the cabin, Jennifer Walsh continued providing updates to the passengers, maintaining the careful balance between honesty and reassurance that was crucial in emergency situations. Sarah could hear occasional questions from passengers over the intercom, voices tight with concern but not yet approaching panic. Professional crew training was holding the situation together, creating space for her to focus on the technical challenge of bringing everyone safely to the ground. Captain Harrison's condition remained stable but unchanged. His breathing was regular, his pulse steady but weak, and he showed no signs of regaining consciousness. Sarah had done everything possible to make him comfortable while maintaining her primary responsibility for controlling the aircraft. The emergency medical procedures she had learned in training were proving their worth, though she hoped never to use them again. The radio brought another transmission from Denver Approach Control. Mountain View 847. Contact Denver Tower on 118.3 for approach clearance. Emergency equipment is in position. Medical personnel standing by. You're cleared for straight in. Approach to runway 16R. Sarah acknowledged the handoff and switched radio frequencies, beginning the final phase of what had become the most challenging flight of her career. In 12 minutes, she would either be a hero or a statistic, but right now she was simply a pilot doing her job under extraordinary circumstances. The aircraft continued its steady progress toward Denver, carrying 47 lives and the hopes of everyone watching from the ground below. The tower controller's voice carried a different tone now, sharper with urgency. Mountain View 847. We're showing weather deteriorating rapidly at Denver International. Heavy snow showers moving in from the west, visibility dropping to less than half a mile. Runway conditions becoming marginal. Sarah felt her stomach tighten as she processed the information. What had been a challenging situation was rapidly becoming impossible. She peered through the windscreen toward Denver, seeing the dark wall of clouds rolling across the plains like a gray curtain being drawn across the sky. The storm had developed faster than the meteorologists predicted, transforming clear morning air into a wall of snow and wind that would make landing at a major airport extremely dangerous, especially for a single pilot managing an emergency. Tower 847, copy the weather update. What are conditions at alternate airports? She keyed the radio while scanning her charts for backup options. Colorado Springs was 60 miles south, but that would mean flying through the worst of the approaching storm. Cheyenne was 90 miles north, beyond their fuel capacity with current consumption rates. Every option carried risks that multiplied with each passing minute. 847. Be advised Colorado Springs is reporting similar conditions. Visibility deteriorating rapidly. Cheyenne is clear, but beyond your stated fuel capacity. We're checking smaller fields in your area. The controller's voice carried the weight of someone calculating impossible equations, trying to find a solution that didn't exist in the standard playbook. Behind the weather briefing, Sarah could hear Captain Harrison's breathing change, becoming more labored and irregular. She glanced at him and saw that his color had worsened, lips taking on a bluish tinge that indicated insufficient oxygen. His condition was deteriorating just as rapidly as the weather, creating a dual emergency that demanded immediate resolution. Every minute they spent in the air increased the risk to both Harrison and the 47 passengers depending on her. Decisions. The radio crackled with a new voice, this one from Mountain View Operations. 847. This is Thompson again. We're coordinating with flight service for alternate landing sites. There's a small field at Monument, about 15 miles south of your current position, but it's only 3,200 feet of runway. Probably too short for the ERJ with your current weight. Sarah ran the numbers quickly in her head. The Embraer needed at least 4,000 feet of runway for a safe landing with their current passenger and fuel load. Monument's short strip would require either dumping fuel, which wasn't possible on the ERJ-145, or accepting a landing that would almost certainly result in an overrun. Neither option was acceptable with paying passengers aboard. Operations 847, Monument Field is too short. We need alternatives. She kept her voice steady while her mind raced through other possibilities. Emergency landings weren't supposed to be this complicated. The textbooks and training scenarios always provided clear-cut options. Airports with long runways and emergency equipment. Reality was proving far messier than the simplified situations. She had practiced in the simulator. Captain Harrison stirred again, his eyes opening briefly before closing. He mumbled something incoherent, his hand moving weakly toward his chest. Sarah loosened his harness and tried to make him more comfortable, but there was little she could do at altitude. He needed immediate medical attention, the kind that required paramedics and hospital equipment, not first aid administered in a cockpit at 28,000 feet. A different voice came over the radio, identifying himself as an air traffic supervisor. Mountain View 847, this is Denver Center Supervisor. We're looking at unconventional options for your situation. There's a section of Interstate 25 south of Denver that's currently under construction. 3-mile straight stretch with minimal traffic due to lane closures. It's not approved for aircraft operations, but it's an option if conventional airports aren't viable. The suggestion hung in the air like an impossible dare. Highway landings were the stuff of action movies and emergency training videos, not something that happened to regional airline pilots on routine Thursday morning flights. Sarah had studied the procedures in theory, knew the basics of evaluating road surfaces and traffic patterns, but the gap between textbook knowledge and practical application felt enormous. Supervisor 847, can you provide more details on the highway option? She heard her own voice asking the question and wondered when she had decided to seriously consider landing a commercial airliner on Interstate 25. The answer came immediately. The moment she realized that all conventional options carried unacceptable risks to the people depending on her judgment. 847. The construction zone extends from Monument to Castle Rock, approximately 18 miles of limited access highway. Current traffic is light due to early morning hours and construction delays. Colorado State Patrol is being notified of the situation and can assist with traffic control if needed. The supervisor's voice carried the careful neutrality of someone presenting facts without making recommendations, leaving the impossible decision entirely in her hands. Sarah studied her charts, trying to visualize the terrain south of Denver. Interstate 25 ran north-south through relatively flat country, avoiding the worst of the mountain terrain that surrounded the metropolitan area. The construction zone would provide a straighter, wider surface than normal highway conditions. Most importantly, it was below the weather line, where visibility remained good despite the approaching storm. The passenger address system crackled to life as Jennifer Walsh provided another update to the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, we're currently working with air traffic control to find the best airport for our landing due to changing weather conditions. Please remain seated with your seatbelts securely fastened. We'll keep you updated as the situation develops. Professional calm masking growing concern, the kind of careful communication that kept panic at bay while acknowledging the reality of their situation. Captain Harrison's condition showed no signs of improvement. His breathing remained shallow and irregular, his skin color poor, despite the supplemental oxygen Sarah had activated from the emergency medical kit. She checked his pulse again, finding it rapid and thready, confirming her assessment that he was experiencing a significant cardiac event. Every minute of delay increased the risk of permanent damage or worse. 847, Denver Center. Colorado State Patrol reports they can have Interstate 25 cleared of traffic within 10 minutes. Emergency vehicles are being positioned along the construction zone. The highway surface is concrete, in good condition, with no significant obstructions. Are you considering this option? The controller's question forced her to confront the decision she had been avoiding. Landing on a highway violated every conventional rule of commercial aviation. The risks were enormous. No arresting deer if the landing went long, no fire suppression systems if something went wrong, no control tower to coordinate the approach. But conventional alternatives were disappearing as quickly as the weather deteriorated. Sometimes the least acceptable option became the only acceptable option. Denver Center 847. I need to evaluate all factors before making this decision. Can you confirm exact runway length and surface conditions? She was buying time, running through mental checklists that didn't exist for the situation. Training, had prepared her for engine failures, hydraulic problems, and electrical emergencies, but not for choosing between an impossible landing and an impossible approach. The radio brought confirmation from multiple sources. The highway surface was smooth concrete, recently resurfaced as part of the construction project. The State Patrol could clear traffic for a 5-mile stretch, providing adequate length for approach and rollout. Emergency vehicles were already moving into position, creating an impromptu rescue apparatus along the interstate. Everything was falling into place, except for the most important element, her decision to attempt something that had never been tried with a commercial airliner carrying passengers. Sarah's thoughts drifted to her father, Tom Mitchell, who had spent 30 years flying crop dusters over the Colorado plains. He had landed on roads, fields, and improvised strips when mechanical problems or weather forced emergency decisions. His voice echoed in her memory from countless evenings when he shared stories of flying by instinct rather than regulation, trusting aircraft performance over bureaucratic procedures. "The airplane doesn't care whether it's landing on concrete or asphalt," he had told her during her early flight training. "Runway length matters, surface condition matters, but the airplane just wants to touch down and roll to a stop. Everything else is human complication." Simple words that seemed profound now, as she faced a decision that would define the rest of her career and possibly the lives of everyone aboard. The weather update from Denver International confirmed her worst fears. Visibility had dropped to less than a quarter mile, with heavy snow and gusting winds creating conditions that would challenge even the most experienced airline crews. The storm was moving faster than predicted, eliminating the possibility of waiting for conditions to improve. Decision time had arrived whether she was ready or not. Captain Harrison's vital signs remained stable but showed no improvement. His breathing was regular but shallow, his pulse weak but consistent. The emergency medical kit contained basic supplies, but nothing that could address a serious cardiac event. He needed immediate hospital care, the kind that required getting him on the ground as quickly as possible. Every minute of delay increased the risk of permanent damage. "Mountain View 847, this is Denver Center. We need your decision on the highway landing option. Weather at all conventional airports is below minimums and deteriorating. The State Patrol reports Interstate 25 is clear of traffic and emergency vehicles are in position." The controller's voice carried the weight of someone who had exhausted all conventional options and was waiting for her to choose between bad alternatives and worse ones. Sarah looked at the fuel gauges, noting that they had enough for perhaps 20 more minutes of flight. Not enough to wait for weather improvement, not enough to reach distant alternate airports. The mathematics of the situation had reduced her options to a single choice: attempt the highway landing or risk a fuel exhaustion emergency over terrain that offered no suitable landing sites. Denver Center, Mountain View 847. I'm committing to the highway landing on Interstate 25. Request vectors to the construction zone and coordination with ground emergency services. The words left her mouth before her mind fully processed the magnitude of what she had just agreed to attempt. There was no going back now, no second-guessing the decision that would either save 47 lives or end them. The controller's response was immediate and professional. "Mountain View 847, roger your decision. Turn right heading 200, descend and maintain 8,000 feet. Contact Colorado State Patrol on emergency frequency 155.475 for surface coordination. Emergency vehicles are standing by along the highway. You are cleared for approach to Interstate 25 construction zone." As she banked the aircraft toward the highway, Sarah caught a glimpse of her reflection in the side window. The face looking back at her was calm, focused, professional. It was the face of someone who had spent 3 years being overlooked, underestimated, and passed over for advancement. But it was also the face of someone who had never stopped training, Never stop preparing for the moment when preparation would meet opportunity under the worst possible circumstances. The Embraer descended through thin mountain air toward a strip of concrete that had never been designed for aircraft operations. Below them, emergency vehicles moved into position along Interstate 25, their flashing lights creating a corridor of safety in an otherwise impossible situation. The passengers had no idea that their first officer was about to attempt something that violated every rule in the aviation handbook, trusting in physics and skill rather than regulation and precedent. Jennifer Walsh appeared in the cockpit doorway, her professional composure intact despite the stress of the situation. "Sarah, the passengers are getting anxious. Should I make another announcement?" Her use of the first name indicated how far they had moved beyond normal procedures into uncharted territory where rank mattered less than competence. "Tell them we're diverting to an emergency landing site." "Due to weather," Sarah replied without taking her eyes off the instruments. "Standard emergency procedures, nothing they need to worry about." It was technically true, though it omitted the detail that their emergency landing site was a highway rather than an airport. Some information was better shared after successful completion rather than during execution. The radio brought updates from the State Patrol Coordination Center. "Aircraft calling for highway landing. This is Colorado State Patrol Emergency Coordinator. Interstate 25 is closed to traffic from mile marker 182 to mile marker 187. Emergency vehicles are positioned at half-mile intervals. Surface winds are calm, visibility unrestricted. You are cleared for landing on the southbound lanes." Sarah acknowledged the transmission while running through her mental checklist for emergency landing procedures. Gear down, flaps set for maximum drag, approach speed calculated for minimum distance. The ERJ-145 was a forgiving aircraft, but it had never been designed for highway operations. She would have to rely on precise speed control and perfect timing to make this work. Captain Harrison stirred again, his eyes opening with momentary clarity. "What's happening?" he asked weakly, his voice barely audible over the cockpit noise. Sarah glanced at him, noting that his color remained poor, but his awareness seemed slightly improved. "You had a medical emergency," she explained quickly. "I'm handling the landing. Try to stay calm and breathe normally." She didn't mention the highway approach, seeing no benefit in adding stress to his already compromised condition. He nodded weakly and closed his eyes again, trusting her judgment in a way that 3 years of flying together had never quite achieved. The highway appeared ahead, a gray ribbon stretching across the Colorado landscape. From altitude, it looked impossibly narrow, nothing like the broad runways she was accustomed to using. But as they descended, the perspective improved, revealing a surface that was actually wider than many smaller airports. The construction zone had removed normal highway barriers, creating additional width that would accommodate the ERJ's wingspan. Emergency vehicles lined both sides of the highway, their red and blue lights creating a visual approach path toward the designated landing zone. Sarah could see fire trucks, ambulances, and state patrol vehicles positioned at regular intervals, ready to respond if something went wrong. The level of coordination was impressive, demonstrating that emergency services were prepared for situations that fell outside normal operational parameters. Mountain View 847, you are 3 miles from touchdown zone. Surface winds calm, no. Traffic observed on highway. Emergency crews report ready for aircraft arrival. The State Patrol Coordinator's voice carried the calm efficiency of someone accustomed to managing crisis situations, though this was probably his first aircraft emergency landing. Sarah configured the aircraft for landing, extending the gear and setting flaps for maximum drag. The ERJ settled into a stable approach attitude, descending at the correct angle toward the highway surface. Everything felt normal except for the complete absence of runway lights, control tower, and all the infrastructure that made commercial aviation possible. This was flying reduced to its most basic elements: pilot, aircraft, and a place to land. The passengers could see the highway approaching through their windows now, though most probably assumed it was simply terrain features rather than their intended landing site. Sarah heard no panic from the cabin, just the normal quiet that preceded any landing. Jennifer Walsh had done an excellent job maintaining calm without revealing the extraordinary nature of their approach. At 1 mile from touchdown, the highway filled the windscreen like a normal runway approach. The concrete surface looked smooth and wide enough for the ERJ's main gear. State Patrol vehicles had positioned themselves to mark the touchdown zone, their lights providing the visual references that airport lighting systems normally supplied. Everything was as ready as improvised procedures could make it. Captain Harrison opened his eyes again as the aircraft descended through 500 feet. "Are we landing at Denver?" he asked, his voice still weak but clearer than before. Sarah glanced at him, noting that his color seemed marginally improved. "Emergency landing site," she replied simply. "Everything's under control." It was the kind of calm understatement that defined professional aviation, reducing extraordinary circumstances to routine procedures. Harrison nodded and closed his eyes again, either accepting her explanation or lacking the strength to pursue details. The highway surface rushed up toward them as Sarah flared the aircraft for touchdown. This was the moment of truth, when months of training and years of experience would either prove sufficient or inadequate for circumstances that no manual had ever anticipated. The ERJ settled toward the concrete with the steady descent rate that indicated a successful approach, ready to complete an emergency landing that would either be remembered as miraculous or tragic. The wheels touched concrete at exactly 8:14 a.m. with a sensation that felt both foreign and familiar. Instead of the familiar thump of rubber meeting asphalt runway, there was a harder contact, the sound of aircraft tires gripping highway surface that had never been designed for aviation use. The main gear absorbed the impact smoothly, followed immediately by the nose gear settling onto Interstate 25 with mechanical precision that would have made any airline instructor proud. Sarah immediately deployed the speed brakes and applied firm pressure to the wheel brakes, feeling the familiar deceleration forces that meant the difference between a successful landing and a catastrophic overrun. The ERJ-145 responded exactly as it had been designed to respond, slowing steadily as it rolled down the southbound lanes of the highway. Emergency vehicles tracked their progress from both sides, maintaining formation like an escort of official vehicles surrounding a presidential motorcade. Through the cockpit windows, she could see the faces of emergency personnel watching their approach with expressions that ranged from professional concentration to barely concealed amazement. This was probably the first time any of them had witnessed a commercial airliner using a highway as a runway, though their training had prepared them to respond to aircraft emergencies regardless of location. The coordinated response was impressive, demonstrating the adaptability of emergency services when confronted with situations outside normal parameters. The aircraft decelerated through 60 knots, then 40, then finally rolled to a complete stop approximately 2 miles from the initial touchdown point. Sarah set the parking brake and began the engine shutdown checklist while Captain Harrison stirred in the left seat, his consciousness slowly returning as the immediate stress of flight operations ended. The silence that followed engine shutdown was profound, broken only by the distant sound of approaching emergency vehicles and the quiet hum of aircraft electrical systems running on battery power. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Colorado," Jennifer Walsh announced over the cabin address system with the kind of professional calm that characterized her entire performance during the emergency. "Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened while emergency personnel conduct a routine safety inspection of the aircraft. We'll have you off the plane and on your way shortly." The announcement could have applied to any normal arrival at any normal airport, except for the fact that they were sitting on a highway with emergency lights flashing all around them. Captain Harrison opened his eyes and looked around the cockpit with growing awareness of their situation. His color had improved significantly since landing, though he still appeared weak and disoriented. "Did we land on a road?" he asked, his voice stronger than it had been since the medical emergency began. The question carried a note of disbelief, as if his mind was struggling to process the reality of their location. "Interstate 25 construction zone," Sarah confirmed while completing the shutdown checklist. "You had a cardiac event, weather closed Denver International, and this was our best option." She spoke matter-of-factly, reducing the extraordinary circumstances to a simple sequence of cause and effect. Her hands moved through the familiar routine of securing aircraft systems, muscle memory taking over while her mind began processing what they had just accomplished. Paramedics were already approaching the aircraft, emergency medical equipment visible through the cockpit windows. Sarah could see ambulances positioned nearby, their crews preparing to board the aircraft and assess Captain Harrison's condition. The level of medical response was impressive, demonstrating that emergency services had taken seriously the report of a cardiac emergency aboard the aircraft. The main cabin door opened with the distinctive hiss of pressurization equalizing, followed immediately by the sound of passengers beginning to move around and talk among themselves. Sarah could hear Jennifer Walsh coordinating with emergency personnel, her voice calm and professional as she managed the passenger evacuation process. The flight attendant had performed flawlessly throughout the emergency, maintaining order and calm when panic could have made an already dangerous situation catastrophic. A paramedic climbed into the cockpit carrying medical equipment and immediately focused on Captain Harrison. "I'm Dave Rodriguez with Castle Rock Emergency Medical Services," he introduced himself while beginning his assessment. "Can you tell me your name and what happened?" His questions were standard protocol for cardiac emergencies, designed to assess mental status while gathering critical medical information. Harrison answered the questions clearly, though his voice remained weak. Yes, he knew his name and location. Yes, he remembered chest pain and difficulty breathing. No, he had no history of heart problems, though his father had died of a heart attack at age 58. The paramedic worked efficiently, checking vital signs and preparing Harrison for transport to the nearest cardiac facility, while Sarah completed her post-flight responsibilities. Emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft now, their presence creating an impressive display of coordinated response capability. Fire trucks stood ready to respond to any sign of fuel leaks or electrical problems, though the landing had been gentle enough to avoid any apparent damage to the aircraft. State patrol officers were directing traffic flow and maintaining security around the scene, while emergency medical personnel prepared for passenger evacuation. Sarah completed the cockpit shutdown checklist and gathered her flight bag, preparing to leave the aircraft for the first time since their departure from Pine Valley nearly an hour earlier. An hour that felt like a lifetime, compressed into a sequence of decisions and actions that had transformed a routine commuter flight into something that would be discussed in aviation circles for years to come. She checked her logbook one final time, noting the flight time and unusual destination with the kind of precise record keeping that characterized professional aviation. The passenger evacuation proceeded smoothly, with emergency personnel assisting elderly passengers and families with small children, while Jennifer Walsh coordinated the process from inside the cabin. Sarah could see passengers gathering near the emergency vehicles, most of them looking more curious than frightened now that they were safely on the ground. Many were taking photographs with their phones, documenting what was probably the most unusual travel experience of their lives. Captain Harrison was placed on a gurney and wheeled toward a waiting ambulance, his condition stable enough for transport, but serious enough to require immediate hospital evaluation. The paramedic reported that his vital signs had improved since landing, possibly due to reduced stress levels and lower altitude. but cardiac monitoring would be necessary to determine the extent of any damage. As they loaded him into the ambulance, he caught Sarah's eye and nodded once, a gesture that carried more meaning than words could express. David Thompson from Mountain View Airlines arrived on scene within minutes of the landing, having driven directly from the airport when he realized where the emergency was unfolding. His expression mixed relief with professional concern as he approached Sarah near the aircraft. "How are you doing?" he asked, the question encompassing both her physical condition and her emotional state after completing an unprecedented emergency procedure. "I'm fine," Sarah replied, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. The adrenaline was beginning to fade, replaced by a strange mixture of exhaustion and hyper-alertness that often followed high-stress situations. Her hands were steady, her thinking clear, but she could feel the weight of what had just happened beginning to settle on her shoulders like a heavy coat. Thompson nodded and pulled out his phone to coordinate with airline operations and federal aviation authorities. The unusual nature of the landing would require extensive documentation and investigation, though initial indications suggested that all procedures had been followed correctly given the extraordinary circumstances. "The FAA is sending an investigation team," he informed her. "Standard procedure for any emergency landing, especially one this unusual. You'll need to be available for interviews and paperwork." Media vehicles were beginning to arrive on scene, drawn by reports of an airliner landing on Interstate 25. News helicopters circled overhead while television trucks positioned themselves along the highway perimeter, their cameras capturing images that would soon be broadcast around the world. Sarah realized that their emergency landing was about to become a very public story, though she had been too focused on immediate concerns to consider the media implications. A Federal Aviation Administration inspector arrived 30 minutes after landing, identifying himself as Robert Chun and explaining that he would be conducting the preliminary investigation into the emergency. His questions were thorough but not accusatory, focusing on the sequence of events that led to the highway landing and the decision-making process that had guided her actions. Sarah answered each question precisely, drawing on her detailed knowledge of emergency procedures and aircraft systems. "In your opinion, was the highway landing the safest available option given the circumstances?" Inspector Chun asked, the question cutting to the heart of the investigation. Sarah considered her response carefully, knowing that her answer would become part of the official record and could affect both her career and the airline's liability exposure. "Given Captain Harrison's medical condition, deteriorating weather at conventional airports, and our fuel state, I believe the highway landing provided the best chance of a safe outcome for all persons aboard," she replied. The formal language reflected her understanding that every word would be scrutinized by investigators, lawyers, and aviation safety experts, but the substance reflected her genuine belief that she had made the right choice under impossible circumstances. The passengers were transported to nearby hotels and rental car facilities, their travel plans disrupted, but their lives intact. Many stopped to thank Sarah personally before boarding the buses, expressing gratitude that went beyond normal passenger crew interactions. One elderly woman hugged her and whispered, "You brought us home, dear. Thank you for bringing us home." The simple words carried an emotional weight that formal recognition could never match. Jennifer Walsh appeared at Sarah's side as the last passengers departed, her own professional composure finally showing signs of strain. "I've never experienced anything like that," she admitted quietly. "The training scenarios never covered highway landings with passengers aboard. You made it look routine." The compliment from a fellow crew member meant more than praise from passengers or management, representing recognition from someone who understood the technical and emotional challenges of the situation. The aircraft sat on Interstate 25 like a sleeping giant, its presence both impressive and surreal against the backdrop of highway infrastructure. Arrangements were being made to tow it to a nearby airport once investigators completed their examination, though the logistics of moving a commercial airliner along public roads would require extensive coordination with multiple agencies. For now, it remained where Sarah had brought it to rest, a testament to the possibility of successful outcomes, even in impossible situations. News reports were already beginning to circulate, describing the emergency landing in terms that ranged from factual to sensational. Sarah ignored the media attention, focusing instead on the technical debriefing process that would help investigators understand exactly what had happened and why. Her detailed knowledge of aircraft systems and emergency procedures proved invaluable in explaining the decision-making process that had led to such an unconventional resolution. As afternoon approached, Sarah found herself standing beside Interstate 25, watching recovery crews prepare to move the ERJ-145 to Denver International Airport for detailed inspection. The highway had been reopened to traffic, with only a small section remaining closed around the aircraft. Normal transportation patterns were resuming, though the presence of a commercial airliner on the roadway continued to draw curious onlookers and media attention. Captain Harrison's condition had been upgraded to stable at Denver General Hospital, where cardiac specialists determined that he had suffered a relatively minor heart attack that responded well to immediate treatment. The prognosis was good for full recovery, though he would be grounded pending medical certification review. His career as an airline pilot might be over, but his life had been saved by the quick response and professional competence of emergency medical personnel. The investigation would continue for weeks, examining every aspect of the emergency from the initial medical event through the final engine shutdown on the highway. Sarah knew that her actions would be scrutinized by experts who had never faced similar circumstances, judged by standards that had been developed for conventional airport operations rather than highway emergencies. The outcome would determine not only her own career prospects, but also the precedent for future emergency situations. Mountain View Airlines issued a public statement praising the crew's performance and emphasizing their commitment to safety. Under all circumstances, the carefully worded release acknowledged the unusual nature of the emergency while defending the SUNGLA decision-making process that had led to the highway landing. Public reaction was overwhelmingly positive, though aviation industry professionals reserved judgment pending completion of the official investigation. Sarah's phone buzzed with messages from friends, family, and colleagues who had seen news reports of the emergency landing. Most expressed amazement and congratulations, though a few carried underlying questions about whether she had taken unnecessary risks with passenger safety. The second-guessing was inevitable, part of the Monday morning quarterback mentality that followed any unusual event in the highly regulated world of commercial aviation. As evening approached, Sarah finally allowed herself a moment to consider the personal implications of what had happened. 3 years as a first officer had prepared her technically for emergency situations, but nothing could have prepared her emotionally for the responsibility of making life and death decisions for 47 people while sitting in the right seat of a commercial airliner. The weight of that responsibility would stay with her long after the investigation concluded and the media attention faded. The sun was setting behind the Rocky Mountains as recovery crews completed their preparations for moving the aircraft. Sarah watched from a distance, noting how small and vulnerable the ERJ-145 looked when separated from its normal airport environment. It was just a machine, she realized, remarkable in its engineering but ultimately dependent on human judgment for safe operation. Today that judgment had proven sufficient, but tomorrow would bring new challenges that would test the limits of training and experience in ways that no manual could anticipate. David Thompson approached as she prepared to leave the scene, his expression reflecting the complex mixture of relief and concern that characterized the airline's response to the emergency. "The company wants me to tell you that you'll be receiving a formal commendation for your actions today," he said. "But more importantly, you saved 47 lives plus your own. That's something that can't be measured in terms of company policy or regulation." Sarah nodded, accepting the recognition while understanding that the real measure of success would be determined by investigators and industry, experts who would examine every decision with the benefit of hindsight and unlimited time for analysis. For now, it was enough to know that everyone had survived an emergency that could easily have ended differently, and that her training and judgment had proven adequate when tested under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. 3 months after the highway landing, Sarah sat in a conference room at FAA headquarters in Washington, facing a panel of investigators who had spent 12 weeks analyzing every second of Mountain View Flight 847's emergency descent, the final hearing represented the culmination of the most thorough investigation in the agency's history of unconventional emergency landings, involving flight data analysis, weather reconstructions, medical expert testimony, and engineering assessments. That filled over 3,000 pages of documentation. The lead investigator, Dr. Patricia Williams, reviewed the findings with methodical precision. First Officer Mitchell, after extensive analysis of flight data recordings, air traffic control communications, weather conditions, and passenger statements. This panel has concluded that your decision to attempt the highway landing represented sound aeronautical judgment under extraordinary circumstances. The formal language couldn't entirely mask the underlying amazement at what had been accomplished on Interstate 25. Sarah nodded, accepting the vindication, while remembering the weight of uncertainty that had accompanied every decision during those critical 23 minutes. The investigation had scrutinized her actions with the kind of detailed analysis that was impossible during real-time emergency operations, confirming that each choice had been technically sound and professionally executed. More importantly, it had established precedent for future emergency situations that might require similarly unconventional solutions. The panel's findings would be incorporated into emergency procedures training for commercial pilots throughout the industry, creating educational scenarios based on the actual events of Flight 847. Sarah's decisions would be studied in aviation schools and discussed in professional journals, though she took little satisfaction in becoming a case study for extraordinary circumstances that she hoped no other pilot would ever face. Captain Robert Harrison had recovered fully from his cardiac event and returned to limited flying duties after extensive medical evaluation and recertification. His gratitude towards Sarah was genuine but understated, expressed through professional courtesy rather than dramatic gestures. They had flown together twice since his return, their cockpit interactions marked by a mutual respect that had been absent during their previous assignments together. The media attention had gradually subsided as other stories captured public interest, though the highway landing continued to generate occasional features and anniversary articles. Sarah had declined most interview requests, preferring to let the official investigation speak for itself rather than participating in the kind of sensationalized coverage that often distorted aviation stories. Her reluctance to seek publicity had enhanced rather than diminished her professional reputation. Mountain View Airlines had promoted her to captain ahead of the normal progression schedule, recognizing both her demonstrated competence and the positive publicity generated by the emergency landing. The promotion came with assignment to the airline's newest Embraer E-jets, flying longer routes that challenged her skills while providing career advancement that had seemed impossible just months earlier. The irony wasn't lost on her that extraordinary circumstances had accomplished what years of routine competence had failed to achieve. The aircraft involved in the highway landing had been thoroughly inspected and returned to service after minor repairs to the landing gear, which had shown stress consistent with the harder surface contact of highway concrete versus airport asphalt. Engineers had been amazed by how well the ERJ-145 had performed under conditions far outside its design parameters, leading to enhanced confidence in the aircraft's structural integrity and emergency capabilities. Jennifer Walsh had also received recognition for her performance during the emergency, earning a commendation from the Association of Flight Attendants and promotion to lead flight attendant on international routes. Her calm management of passenger communications had been cited as a textbook example of crew resource management under pressure, demonstrating how professional training could overcome the natural human tendency toward panic in crisis situations. The highway landing had generated unexpected consequences throughout the aviation industry. Emergency response procedures had been updated to include coordination protocols for unconventional landing sites, recognizing that modern commercial aviation might occasionally require solutions that fell outside traditional airport infrastructure. State patrol agencies had developed rapid response capabilities for aircraft emergencies on major highways, creating coordination frameworks that hadn't existed before Flight 847. Sarah's apartment had gradually filled with letters from passengers, aviation professionals, and young women considering careers in commercial aviation. The correspondence revealed how her story had resonated beyond the immediate circumstances of the emergency, inspiring people who faced their own professional challenges and workplace obstacles. She answered each letter personally, sharing encouragement, while avoiding any suggestion that extraordinary circumstances were necessary for career success. The small house she had inherited from her father had been transformed into a quiet retreat, where she could escape the residual attention that accompanied her newfound recognition. Tom Mitchell's flight journal remained on the kitchen table, its pages now supplemented by her own detailed accounts of the highway landing and subsequent investigation. The combination of father's wisdom and daughter's experience created a record of aviation evolution across 2 generations. Pine Valley Regional Airport had installed a small plaque near the operations building commemorating Flight 847's departure and emergency return, though Sarah had requested that her name not be prominently featured. The memorial focused instead on the successful outcome and the coordinated response of multiple agencies, reflecting her preference for recognizing collective effort rather than individual achievement. The plaque had become a stop for aviation enthusiasts and student pilots learning about emergency procedures. Captain Harrison's medical evaluation had revealed underlying cardiovascular conditions that had gone undetected during routine flight physicals, leading to enhanced screening procedures for airline pilots over age 50. His case had contributed to improved understanding of altitude-related cardiac stress and the importance of comprehensive medical monitoring for commercial flight crews. The changes might prevent similar emergencies in the future, adding lasting value to the trauma he had experienced. The Federal Aviation Administration had created a new category of emergency landing authorization for highway operations, establishing criteria and procedures that could be implemented when conventional airports were unavailable. The regulations were directly based on lessons learned from Flight 847, creating a formal framework for situations that had previously existed only in theoretical training scenarios. Sarah's promotion to captain had brought assignment to routes that connected Pine Valley with major metropolitan airports, allowing her to build experience in complex airspace while maintaining her connection to the regional airline that had given her opportunities when larger carriers had shown little interest. The flights were more challenging than her previous first officer duties, demanding constant decision-making and crew leadership that stretched her professional capabilities. The investigation had also revealed systemic issues within the airline industry regarding gender advancement and the subtle biases that limited opportunities for qualified female pilots. Sarah's story had become a catalyst for discussions about diversity and inclusion in commercial aviation, though she remained uncomfortable with the suggestion that her emergency performance had somehow validated women's capabilities in the cockpit. Competence, she believed, was demonstrated through consistent professional performance rather than extraordinary circumstances. Dr. Williams concluded the hearing by summarizing the panel's recommendations for industry-wide implementation of lessons learned from Flight 847. This emergency demonstrates the importance of comprehensive training, sound decision-making under pressure, and the adaptability required for situations that fall outside normal operational parameters, she stated. First Officer Mitchell's performance provides a model for professional competence that will benefit commercial aviation for years to come. The formal proceedings ended with handshakes and congratulations, though Sarah felt more relief than satisfaction at the investigation's conclusion. 3 months of scrutiny had validated her decisions while creating a permanent record of one extraordinary day when training, judgment, and favorable circumstances had combined to produce a successful outcome. The experience had changed her perspective on both the possibilities and responsibilities that came with professional aviation. Mountain View Airlines held a quiet ceremony to mark the conclusion of the investigation and Sarah's promotion to captain. The event was attended by company officials, fellow pilots, and representatives from emergency services agencies who had participated in the highway landing response. Captain Harrison presented her with a custom flight bag engraved with the date of Flight 847, a gesture that acknowledged their shared experience without excessive drama. The ceremony included remarks from David Thompson, who had been promoted to Vice President of Operations, partly based on his handling of the Flight 847 emergency. Sarah Mitchell demonstrated that professional competence isn't about following rules blindly, but about understanding principles well enough to apply them creatively when circumstances demand innovation, he said. The comment reflected a growing industry recognition that rigid adherence to procedures could sometimes conflict with safety objectives. Jennifer Walsh attended the ceremony wearing her new lead flight attendant uniform, her career advancement, representing another positive outcome from the emergency. Her remarks focused on the importance of crew coordination and the trust that must exist between flight deck and cabin crew during crisis situations. The highway landing had demonstrated how individual competence could combine with team effort to overcome seemingly impossible challenges. Sarah's brief acceptance speech emphasized the collective nature of the successful outcome, crediting air traffic controllers, emergency responders, airline management, and her fellow crew members for their contributions to passenger safety. She avoided claiming personal credit for the emergency resolution, maintaining the professional humility that had characterized her approach throughout the investigation and media attention. The inscription on her new captain's wings read simply, "Captain Sarah Mitchell, Mountain View Airlines," without reference to the highway landing or emergency procedures. She had requested the standard inscription, preferring that her future performance as captain be evaluated independently of the extraordinary circumstances that had accelerated her advancement. The promotion represented both an ending and a beginning, closing one chapter of her career while opening opportunities that had previously seemed beyond reach. As the ceremony concluded, Sarah found herself standing outside the airport terminal, watching aircraft operations continue with their normal rhythm of arrivals and departures. The routine nature of commercial aviation was both its greatest strength and its most vulnerable characteristic, requiring constant vigilance to maintain safety standards, while accommodating millions of passengers who trusted their lives to professional competence they rarely saw or understood. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Captain Harrison, who had returned to flying regional routes after his medical clearance. "Smooth landing at Denver International this morning," he wrote. "Runway 16R, no drama. Sometimes routine is perfect." The message carried more meaning than its simple words suggested, acknowledging how extraordinary circumstances had given both of them a deeper appreciation for normal operations. The drive home took her past the section of Interstate 25, where Flight 847 had touched down 3 months earlier. The highway showed no trace of their emergency landing, its concrete surface bearing only the normal wear patterns of daily traffic. A small memorial marker had been installed by the Colorado Department of Transportation, noting the location where commercial aviation history had been made through successful adaptation to impossible circumstances. Sarah's modest house appeared, unchanged from the outside, though the interior now reflected her enhanced financial situation and professional status. Tom Mitchell's photograph remained prominently displayed, showing a man whose own aviation career had been built on practical competence rather than dramatic gestures. His influence on her approach to flying had been validated by the highway landing, demonstrating how fundamental skills could overcome extraordinary challenges. The leather flight journal that had belonged to her father now included detailed entries documenting Flight 847's emergency descent and highway landing. Her handwriting filled pages with technical details, decision rationales, and personal reflections that would preserve the experience long after official reports had been filed away. The journal represented continuity between generations of aviators who had faced their own versions of impossible circumstances. Evening brought the familiar sight of aircraft lights moving across the Colorado sky. Commercial flights following established routes between major airports with the kind of routine precision that made air travel both safe and unremarkable. Sarah watched from her back porch, noting how the normal operations she observed represented thousands of professional decisions made correctly by pilots. She would never meet flying passengers she would never know. Her promotion to captain had brought new responsibilities that extended beyond individual competence to include crew leadership, passenger safety, and the kind of decision-making authority that could affect dozens of lives with each flight. The definitive highway landing had prepared her for the weight of command in ways that normal training progression could never accomplish, providing confidence born from successful management of genuine crisis rather than simulated emergencies. The investigation's conclusion had generated speaking invitations from aviation organizations, safety conferences, and professional development seminars interested in her perspective on emergency decision-making and crew resource management. Sarah had accepted a few carefully selected engagements, sharing lessons learned while avoiding the kind of celebrity status that could overshadow her primary identity as a working airline pilot. 3 years of being overlooked and underestimated had ended with a single 23-minute flight that demonstrated competence in terms that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. The irony wasn't lost on her that extraordinary circumstances had accomplished what routine excellence had failed to achieve, though she understood that both types of performance reflected the same underlying commitment to professional standards and passenger safety. As night settled over the Colorado plains, Sarah completed her captain upgrade training materials while Tom Mitchell's voice echoed in memory from countless evenings when flying stories had filled their modest home. "The airplane doesn't care about your rank or recognition," he had often said. "It only cares whether you understand what it needs to fly safely." Simple wisdom that had proven sufficient for highway landings and routine operations alike. The future stretched ahead with enhanced opportunities and increased responsibilities that would test her capabilities in ways both routine and extraordinary. Captain Sarah Mitchell had proven herself capable of handling impossible circumstances with professional competence, creating confidence that whatever challenges lay ahead could be met with the same quiet determination that had brought Flight 847 safely to ground on Interstate 25. Tomorrow would bring new flights, new passengers, and new opportunities to demonstrate that professional aviation was built on individual competence, multiplied by collective effort and guided by judgment that could adapt proven principles to unprecedented circumstances. Sometimes the most profound changes came not through dramatic announcements, but through steady performance that spoke louder than words, proving worth through action rather than recognition. 5 years had passed since the highway landing, and Captain Sarah Mitchell stood before a class of new hire pilots at Mountain View Airlines training facility. sharing the lessons that had emerged from that extraordinary morning on Interstate 25. The classroom was filled with young aviators who had grown up hearing about Flight 847, studying it in aviation schools, and dreaming of careers that might someday demand similar judgment under pressure. Emergency decision-making isn't about heroics, she told the class, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had developed through thousands of hours in the captain's seat. It's about understanding your aircraft, knowing your options, and making the best choice available with the information you have at the time. Sometimes that choice will be unconventional, but it should never be reckless. The words reflected years of reflection on the balance between innovation and safety that define professional aviation. Among the new hires sat Maria Santos, a young woman whose application essay had cited Sarah's story as inspiration for pursuing a commercial aviation career. The connection wasn't unusual. Flight 847 had become a recruiting tool for airlines seeking to diversify their pilot ranks, demonstrating that competence and judgment mattered more than traditional demographic patterns. Sarah recognized the responsibility that came with unintended role model status, though she remained uncomfortable with the suggestion that one emergency landing had somehow validated women's place in commercial cockpits. The training facility displayed a cutaway diagram of the highway landing approach, showing the descent profile and decision points that had led to the unconventional touchdown. Student pilots studied the exhibit during breaks, analyzing the technical aspects of an event that had become legendary within aviation circles. Sarah occasionally found herself answering questions about details that seemed mundane compared to the media portrayals, though she understood that technical accuracy mattered more than dramatic narrative. Mountain View Airlines had grown significantly in the 5 years since Flight 847, expanding routes and upgrading equipment, partly based on the positive publicity generated by the emergency landing. Sarah now flew the airline's newest Airbus, A220, aircraft on longer routes that connected regional cities with major metropolitan areas, commanding respect from air traffic controllers and fellow pilots who recognized her name from news reports and industry publications. The A220's advanced systems and fly-by-wire technology represented a significant evolution from the mechanical simplicity of the ERJ-145, though Sarah had discovered that fundamental piloting skills remained unchanged. Regardless of aircraft sophistication, her experience during the highway landing had demonstrated that technology could fail or become inadequate, leaving human judgment as the ultimate safety factor in commercial aviation. Captain Harrison had retired from active flying the previous year, accepting a position as chief pilot for a corporate flight department that valued his experience and medical history as assets rather than liabilities. His recovery had been complete, but the cardiac event had changed his perspective on risk management and work-life balance in ways that made airline scheduling incompatible with his priorities. He occasionally sent Sarah updates on his new career, expressing gratitude that their shared emergency had led to positive outcomes for both of them. The Federal Aviation Administration had incorporated lessons from Flight 847 into updated emergency procedures training, creating simulation scenarios that challenged pilots to consider unconventional landing sites when conventional airports were unavailable. The training had already proven valuable in several real-world emergencies, though none had required actual highway landings. Sarah took quiet satisfaction in knowing that her decisions had contributed to enhanced safety throughout the aviation industry. Jennifer Walsh had left Mountain View Airlines to join a major international carrier, her career advancement accelerated by the leadership skills demonstrated during Flight 847. Her new position involved training flight attendants in emergency procedures, with particular emphasis on crew coordination and passenger management during crisis situations. She maintained contact with Sarah through occasional messages that acknowledged their shared experience without dwelling on past events. The investigation report from Flight 847 had become required reading in aviation safety courses throughout the industry, its detailed analysis providing insights into decision-making under pressure and the importance of comprehensive emergency training. Sarah had contributed to several follow-up studies, examining the psychological and technical factors that enabled successful outcomes during unconventional emergencies, though she preferred focusing on practical applications rather than academic analysis. Her promotion to captain had brought opportunities for additional training and career development that had previously been unavailable. Sarah had completed advanced courses in crew resource management, emergency procedures, and airline management, building expertise that extended beyond basic piloting skills. The enhanced qualifications had positioned her for potential advancement to training captain or operations management roles, though she remained committed to line flying for the foreseeable future. The small house inherited from her father had been expanded and renovated, its improvements funded by the financial benefits of captain status and the speaking fees from aviation conferences where Sarah shared lessons learned from Flight 847. The renovations included a dedicated office where she maintained detailed flight records and continued the journaling tradition started by Tom Mitchell decades earlier. The combination of father's wisdom and daughter's experience filled multiple volumes with insights into aviation evolution across 2 generations. Pine Valley Regional Airport had dedicated its new pilot training facility to the memory of Tom Mitchell, recognizing his contributions to regional aviation and his influence on his daughter's career. Sarah had spoken at the dedication ceremony, sharing stories of her father's impact on her understanding of aviation fundamentals and the importance of maintaining proficiency in basic flying skills regardless of technological advancement. The highway landing site on Interstate 25 had become an unofficial pilgrimage destination for aviation enthusiasts, though the Colorado Department of Transportation had resisted efforts to create a formal memorial that might distract drivers or encourage unsafe behavior. Sarah occasionally drove past the location during trips between Denver and Colorado Springs, noting how routine traffic flow had erased any trace of the extraordinary events that had occurred there. Her speaking engagements at aviation conferences had evolved from recounting the technical details of Flight 847 to discussing broader themes of professional development, emergency preparedness, and the changing demographics of commercial aviation. The presentations attracted diverse audiences, interested in both the specific lessons of the highway landing and the general principles of competence-based career advancement. The media attention that had initially surrounded Flight 847 had largely subsided, replaced by other stories and crises that captured public interest. Sarah appreciated the return to relative anonymity, though she understood that her name would forever be associated with the highway landing in aviation history. The incident had become a case study rather than current news, allowing her to focus on routine professional responsibilities without constant scrutiny. New technology had emerged that might have prevented or simplified the emergency faced by Flight 847, including enhanced weather detection systems and improved medical monitoring equipment for flight crews. Sarah followed these developments with professional interest while recognizing that human judgment would always remain the critical factor when technology reached its limits or circumstances exceeded design parameters. The airline industry had continued evolving in directions that reflected lessons learned from Flight 847 and similar emergencies. Enhanced crew training programs emphasized decision-making skills and scenario-based learning that prepared pilots for situations that fell outside normal operational procedures. Sarah had contributed to several training program developments, sharing insights that helped prepare the next generation of airline pilots for their own potential emergencies. Her current first officers were typically young pilots building experience toward their own captain upgrades, many of whom had studied Flight 847 during their initial training. Sarah found satisfaction in mentoring these developing professionals, sharing practical knowledge while observing how newer generations of pilots approached the same challenges that had defined her own career advancement. The mathematical precision of modern airline operations had expanded to include contingency planning for unconventional emergencies, with dispatch procedures that considered highway landing options when conventional airports became unavailable. The changes represented institutional recognition that rigid adherence to normal procedures could sometimes conflict with safety objectives, validating the flexible thinking that had characterized Sarah's approach to the Flight 847 emergency. Mountain View Airlines had established an annual safety award in recognition of Flight 847's crew performance, honoring employees who demonstrated exceptional judgment under challenging circumstances. Sarah had presented the award for the past 3 years, recognizing colleagues whose competence might otherwise have gone unnoticed except for the enhanced awareness of professional excellence that had emerged from her own experience. The passengers from Flight 847 had maintained informal contact through social media, groups that celebrated their shared survival and expressed ongoing gratitude for the crew's performance. Several had become advocates for aviation safety initiatives, using their experience to support enhanced emergency training and improved medical screening for airline pilots. Their continued engagement demonstrated how extraordinary events could create lasting connections between strangers who had shared life-changing experiences. Sarah's logbook now contained over 12,000 hours of flight time, accumulated through routine operations that had proven far more valuable for career development than the single emergency that had made her famous. The vast majority of her flights had been utterly unremarkable, demonstrating competence through consistent performance rather than dramatic gestures. Professional aviation, she had learned, was built on the accumulation of successful routine operations rather than spectacular emergencies. The aviation industry's recognition of Flight 847's significance had extended to international organizations studying emergency procedures and pilot training methodologies. Sarah had participated in several international conferences, where the highway landing was analyzed in the context of global aviation safety initiatives. The discussions had revealed how lessons learned from American regional airline operations could apply to very different aviation environments around the world. Her father's influence remained evident in her approach to flying, particularly the emphasis on fundamental skills and practical problem-solving that had enabled the highway landing success. Tom Mitchell's flight journal had become a historical document that aviation museums had requested to display, though Sarah preferred keeping it accessible for daily inspiration rather than preserving it as an artifact. The wisdom contained in those handwritten pages continued, providing guidance for challenges that extended far beyond the specific circumstances of crop dusting operations. The 5-year anniversary of Flight 847 had generated renewed media interest and requests for interviews that Sarah had largely declined, preferring to let the incident speak through its lasting impact on aviation safety rather than personal celebrity. The anniversary coverage had focused appropriately on systematic improvements in emergency procedures and crew training rather than individual recognition, reflecting her preference for collective advancement over personal fame. Captain Sarah Mitchell had discovered that extraordinary circumstances could accelerate career development while simultaneously creating expectations for continued exceptional performance. Her post-Flight 847 flying career had been scrutinized more closely than typical airline operations, with passengers, colleagues, and media representatives watching for signs that her highway landing success could be replicated in routine operations. The attention had been manageable but constant, requiring her to maintain performance standards that exceeded normal professional requirements. The young pilots in her training classes represented the future of commercial aviation, shaped by technological advancement and cultural changes that had been accelerated by incidents like Flight 847. Their questions reflected both technical curiosity about emergency procedures and personal interest in career development strategies that could help them navigate an industry that remained challenging despite improved diversity and enhanced safety systems. As Sarah concluded her presentation to the new hire class, she reflected on the unexpected trajectory that had led from 3 years of overlooked competence to recognition as one of the airline industry's most respected professionals. The transformation had required extraordinary circumstances to overcome systemic barriers, though she hoped that future generations would find more conventional paths to career advancement and professional recognition. The classroom emptied slowly as new pilots lingered to ask individual questions and seek advice that extended beyond technical flight procedures. Sarah answered each inquiry with the patience that had characterized her approach to professional development, recognizing that mentoring responsibilities were among the most important aspects of her current position. The investment in younger colleagues would ultimately determine whether lessons learned from Flight 847 would influence aviation safety for decades to come. Walking across the training facility parking lot toward her car, Sarah noticed Maria Santos waiting by the building entrance, apparently hoping for a private conversation. The young pilot's nervousness was evident as she approached, carrying the kind of questions that couldn't be asked in a classroom setting where vulnerability might be perceived as weakness by competitive colleagues. "Captain Mitchell, I wanted to thank you for inspiring my career choice," Maria began, her voice reflecting genuine gratitude mixed with professional respect. "But I also wanted to ask how you handled the pressure of being scrutinized more closely than other pilots after the highway landing. I worry about making mistakes that might reinforce negative stereotypes about women in aviation." Sarah recognized the question as one that had troubled her own thinking for years after Flight 847, the burden of representing broader demographics, rather than simply performing individual professional responsibilities. "The pressure is real," she acknowledged, "but it's also an opportunity to demonstrate that competence comes in many forms. Focus on being the best pilot you can be and let your performance speak for itself. The industry is changing, and your generation will face different challenges than mine did." The conversation continued for several minutes as Sarah shared practical advice about managing career expectations while maintaining focus on fundamental flying skills. Maria's questions revealed both intelligence and determination that suggested she would succeed, regardless of external pressures. Though Sarah understood the value of reassurance from someone who had navigated similar challenges successfully. Driving home through familiar Colorado landscape, Sarah reflected on the continuing influence of a single emergency landing that had occurred 5 years earlier. Flight 847 had demonstrated that extraordinary circumstances could reveal capabilities that might otherwise remain hidden, creating opportunities for individuals while contributing to systematic improvements that benefited the entire aviation industry. The legacy would continue through enhanced training programs, improved emergency procedures, and the careers of pilots like Maria Santos, who had been inspired to pursue aviation despite traditional barriers. The highway where it all began appeared in her rearview mirror as she drove toward home, its surface bearing no trace of the morning when impossible circumstances had demanded unprecedented solutions. Sometimes the most significant changes left no permanent marks on the physical world, living instead in modified procedures, enhanced training programs, and the expanded possibilities available to future generations of aviation professionals. 10 years after Interstate 25, Sarah Mitchell walked through the main terminal at Denver International Airport wearing the 4 stripes of a chief pilot, her new position representing the culmination of a career trajectory that had begun in the most unlikely circumstances. The bustling airport showed no signs of the weather emergency that had once forced a desperate search for alternative landing sites. its modern facilities processing thousands of passengers with the routine efficiency that characterized contemporary commercial aviation. Her appointment as chief pilot for Mountain View Airlines' expanded Western region had been announced quietly, without the media fanfare that had accompanied her earlier career milestones. The promotion reflected recognition of her comprehensive aviation expertise rather than the celebrity status that had followed Flight 847, acknowledging skills developed through a decade of exemplary performance in increasingly responsible positions. Sarah appreciated the professional focus, understanding that sustainable career advancement required demonstration of broad competencies beyond emergency response capabilities. The office that came with her new position overlooked the runways, where hundreds of aircraft operations occurred daily, each one representing successful execution of the kind of routine procedures that formed the foundation of safe commercial aviation. Sarah had requested the window view specifically, wanting to maintain visual connection with active flight operations, even as administrative responsibilities drew her further from hands-on piloting duties. The sight of aircraft taking off and landing served as a constant reminder of the practical realities that should guide management decisions. Maria Santos now wore captain's stripes herself, having progressed through the traditional advancement pipeline with competence that had proven Sarah's mentoring investment worthwhile. Their professional relationship had evolved from instructor-student to colleagues, who shared understanding of the unique pressures faced by women in aviation leadership positions. Maria's success validated the principle that individual excellence could overcome systemic barriers when combined with appropriate support and opportunity. The aviation industry had continued evolving in directions that reflected lessons learned not only from Flight 847, but from accumulated experience with emergency situations that required innovative thinking. Enhanced simulation training now included scenarios based on dozens of real-world incidents, creating educational opportunities that prepared pilots for circumstances that previously existed only in theoretical discussions. Sarah had contributed to many of these training developments, sharing insights that helped bridge the gap between academic knowledge and practical application. Her chief pilot responsibilities included oversight of Mountain View Airlines' expanding pilot training programs, where new hires learned emergency procedures that had been refined through analysis of actual incidents, including the highway landing. The training emphasized decision-making skills and situational awareness rather than rote memorization of procedures, recognizing that effective emergency response required understanding of principles rather than blind adherence to checklists. Captain Harrison had settled into retirement with satisfaction that his aviation career had concluded positively despite the cardiac emergency that had initially seemed to threaten everything he had worked to achieve. His occasional letters to Sarah expressed gratitude for her competence during their shared crisis, while acknowledging that the experience had provided perspective on priorities that extended beyond professional achievement. The medical event that had seemed catastrophic at the time had ultimately contributed to a more balanced and fulfilling later life. The Federal Aviation Administration had established Sarah as a regular consultant on emergency procedures development, recognizing her unique combination of practical experience and analytical thinking. Her contributions extended beyond the specific circumstances of Flight 847 to broader questions of pilot training, crew resource management, and the integration of human judgment with increasingly sophisticated aircraft systems. The consulting work provided intellectual stimulation that complemented her administrative duties while maintaining connection to the technical aspects of aviation that had always fascinated her. Jennifer Walsh had become a vice president for crew training at a major international airline, her career advancement demonstrating how emergency experience could translate into leadership opportunities throughout the aviation industry. Her programs emphasized the kind of calm professionalism that had characterized her performance during Flight 847, training flight attendants to manage passenger communications during crisis situations without creating panic or confusion. The skills she had developed during one extraordinary flight had proven valuable for managing routine challenges that required similar emotional control and clear thinking. Pine Valley Regional Airport had grown substantially in the decades since. Flight 847. Its expansion partly attributed to positive publicity generated by the emergency landing and subsequent media coverage. The airport now served as a hub for Mountain View Airlines regional operations, handling significantly more traffic than the modest facility where Sarah had begun her career as an overlooked first officer. The growth had created opportunities for local pilots and aviation technicians, demonstrating how individual events could generate lasting economic benefits for entire communities. The memorial plaque installed after Flight 847 had been joined by additional recognition of the airport's role in training pilots, who had gone on to significant achievements throughout the aviation industry. Sarah's photograph was included among other notable graduates, though she had requested that the display emphasize collective accomplishments rather than individual recognition. The exhibit served as inspiration for young people considering aviation careers, while documenting the facility's contributions to regional transportation and economic development. Sarah's speaking engagements had evolved from recounting technical details of the highway landing to addressing broader themes of leadership development, crisis management, and organizational change. Her presentations attracted audiences from industries beyond aviation, recognizing that the principles demonstrated during Flight 847 applied to any situation requiring rapid decision-making under pressure. The speaking opportunities provided additional income while allowing her to share insights that might benefit professionals facing their own challenging circumstances. The house that had belonged to her father now served as headquarters for a small aviation consulting business that Sarah operated in addition to her chief pilot duties. The consulting work focused on helping smaller airlines develop emergency procedures and training programs, sharing expertise gained through her combination of practical experience and administrative oversight. Tom Mitchell's flight journal remained prominently displayed in the home office, its pages now supplemented by Sarah's own detailed records of a career that had exceeded anything either of them had imagined possible. Mountain View Airlines had become a case study for successful regional airline growth, its expansion strategy based partly on the reputation for safety and competence that had been enhanced by Flight 847's positive outcome. The airline now operated modern aircraft on routes throughout the western United States, employing hundreds of pilots and support personnel in positions that had been created through sustained business growth. Sarah took satisfaction in knowing that her emergency landing had contributed to opportunities for aviation professionals who had joined the company long after the incident itself. The interstate highway where everything had changed remained a busy transportation corridor, its traffic flow unaffected by the aviation history that had been made on its concrete surface. Sarah occasionally drove the route during business trips, noting how the surrounding landscape had developed with new construction and expanded communities. The growth represented the kind of routine progress that occurred constantly throughout the region, overshadowing the single extraordinary day when a commercial airliner had used the highway as an emergency runway. Advanced aircraft systems had continued evolving in directions that might have prevented or simplified the emergency faced by Flight 847, including enhanced weather detection equipment and improved medical monitoring systems for flight crews. Sarah followed these technological developments with professional interest while maintaining her belief that human judgment would always remain the critical factor when circumstances exceeded the parameters of design specifications or normal operational procedures. Her chief pilot position required regular travel throughout Mountain View Airlines' expanded route system, providing opportunities to observe flight operations at airports ranging from major metropolitan facilities to small regional fields. Variety of operational environments reinforced her understanding of the challenges faced by airline pilots, who must adapt their skills to different aircraft types, weather conditions, and air traffic control procedures on a daily basis. The new pilots joining Mountain View Airlines represented a generation that had grown up with Flight 847 as part of aviation history rather than current news, studying the incident in ground school classes alongside other emergency procedures and case studies. Their questions during training sessions focused on technical aspects of decision-making and crew coordination rather than the personal details that had fascinated media coverage during the years immediately following the highway landing. Sarah's administrative responsibilities included review of incident reports and safety recommendations that reflected the airline industry's continuing commitment to learning from both successful and unsuccessful outcomes. Each report represented an opportunity to identify potential improvements in training, procedures, or equipment that could enhance safety for future operations. The systematic approach to safety management had been refined through analysis of incidents like Flight 847, creating frameworks for continuous improvement that benefited the entire industry. The regional aviation community had recognized Sarah's contributions through various awards and honors that acknowledged both her emergency performance and her subsequent leadership in safety initiatives. She had accepted the recognition graciously while maintaining focus on practical applications rather than ceremonial acknowledgement, understanding that sustainable improvement required ongoing work rather than one-time achievements. Her current office contained photographs from throughout her aviation career, including images from the highway landing aftermath and more recent pictures from training events and industry conferences. The collection documented professional growth that had occurred through both extraordinary circumstances and routine competence, illustrating how individual development could contribute to broader organizational and industry advancement. The influence of Tom Mitchell's approach to aviation remained evident in Sarah's management philosophy, particularly the emphasis on fundamental skills and practical problem solving that had proven essential during Flight 847. His belief that competence mattered more than credentials had been validated through her career progression. Though she understood that contemporary aviation required both technical expertise and formal qualifications to ensure systematic safety standards. As Sarah reviewed operational reports from the previous quarter, she reflected on the continuing evolution of an industry that had been shaped by accumulated experience from thousands of flights, including one extraordinary emergency landing on Interstate 25. The data showed steady improvement in safety statistics and operational efficiency, representing collective progress that resulted from individual competence multiplied by systematic analysis and continuous training. The young pilots now entering commercial aviation would face challenges different from those that had defined her own career development, though the fundamental requirements for sound judgment and technical competence would remain unchanged. Sarah's role in preparing them for those challenges represented perhaps the most important aspect of her current position, extending the influence of Flight 847 through enhanced training and mentoring that would benefit aviation safety for decades to come. 10 years after the highway landing, Sarah Mitchell had become exactly what the aviation industry needed: a leader whose extraordinary experience had been transformed into systematic improvements that benefited everyone who flew. The emergency that had made her famous had evolved into expertise that made flying safer for millions of passengers who would never know her name, but whose journeys were protected by the lessons she had learned and shared. The sun set behind the Rocky Mountains, painting the sky in colors that reminded Sarah of countless evenings when her father had shared aviation stories that seemed impossible until they became part of family history. Now her own story had become part of aviation history, though its greatest value lay not in past achievement, but in continuing Influence on the future of commercial flight safety and professional development. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.